The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. Every light on the command deck of Station Halvanar turned red at once, and for 3 full seconds, nobody moved. I had served the Council for 11 cycles, through border disputes, through trade wars, through the slow, grinding politics of 100 species trying not to destroy each other. I had never heard that particular alarm before. It was the one reserved for a single, specific threat. A human ship had crossed into contested space. I ran to the viewport with the rest of the command staff, and there it was, hanging silent against the stars. One ship, no escort, no fleet behind it, just one long silver vessel, drifting exactly at the edge of our detection range, close enough that we could see it, far enough that our weapons could not reach it without warning. It was not hiding. It was not attacking. It was simply there, like a knock on a door nobody wanted to open. Administrator Dorith Kalin arrived on the deck moments later, her robes still half-fastened, her aides scrambling behind her. She was the kind of official who had built her entire career on control, on knowing outcomes before they happened. I watched her stare at the screen, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw her hands shake. "One ship," she said, as if saying it twice would make it smaller. Why only one ship? Nobody answered her, because nobody knew. That was the terrifying part. Every other species we had encountered sent fleets when they wanted to threaten us, and diplomats when they wanted to talk, and scouts when they wanted to learn. Humans had sent one warship, alone, into space they knew was watched by a dozen sensor arrays and defended by 3 battle stations. It made no strategic sense, and in my experience, when something made no strategic sense, it usually meant we did not understand the sense being made. I was the station's xenopsychologist, which meant it was my job to explain why other minds did what they did. I had built models for the Threlkin, the Osvani, the deep colonies of the Vrask, and every one of those models had worked. Feed in enough history, enough behavior, enough war and peace and trade, and you could predict what a species would do next with frightening accuracy. It was not perfect, but it was reliable enough that the Council had built its entire foreign policy around it. Know your neighbor's fear, and you know your neighbor's next move. Humans did not fit the models. I had read the old reports, thin and incomplete, filed away decades earlier, after our first and only true encounter with them. The reports were vague on purpose, I would later learn, because nobody wanted to admit how badly that encounter had gone. All I knew that day, standing on the deck with alarms still flashing red, was that the last time a human ship had appeared, where it was not expected, 3 Council fleets had been recalled, and never spoken of again. Administrator Kalin turned to me. Her eyes were sharp, but underneath the sharpness was something rawer, something close to fear. "You study minds, Ison. Tell me what that ship wants." I looked at the screen again. The vessel had not moved in 11 minutes. It had not fired a weapon, raised a shield, or transmitted a single signal. It was simply waiting, patient in a way that felt almost deliberate, almost designed to make us uncomfortable. "I don't know," I admitted, "and that should worry you more than if I did." She did not like that answer, but she accepted it, because she had no better one of her own. Within the hour, the full Council chain of command had been notified. High Marshal Orun Thesson, who oversaw the border sectors, arrived by shuttle less than 2 hours later, faster than protocol should have allowed. He was an old soldier, gray at the joints, decorated for wars most of us had only read about. He walked onto the deck already speaking, already giving orders, and yet I noticed that even he kept glancing at the viewport, as though the ship might vanish if he looked away. "Options," he said, addressing no one and everyone. A tactical officer stepped forward, nervous, and listed them quickly. We could hail the ship and demand its purpose. We could move our own vessels into a defensive formation, a show of readiness without provocation. We could strike first, using the battle stations already in range, and eliminate the threat before it could act. Thesson listened to all 3, and I watched his face carefully, the way I had been trained to watch faces. He was afraid of striking first, not because he doubted the Council's strength, but because he remembered something the rest of the room did not. I could see it in the tightening around his eyes. "No first strike," he said finally. "Not against them. Not until we know what we're dealing with." Kalin frowned. "One ship, Marshal. We could end this in minutes." "That's what we thought last time," he said, and the room went quiet in a way that told me everyone present, except me, already knew something I did not. I asked him directly, because it was my job to ask uncomfortable questions. What happened last time? He did not answer immediately. He walked closer to the viewport, hands folded behind his back, watching the silent ship, as though it might answer for him. 40 years ago, he said at last, we found a human colony world. Small, undefended, valuable resources beneath the surface. A council fleet was sent to negotiate mining rights. The humans refused. We had superior numbers, superior technology by every measure our scans could take. Our commanders expected either a quick surrender or a fight we would easily win. We got neither. What happened? I asked again. They evacuated their own colony, he said. Every last person. Children first. They gave up a world rather than let us take it by pressure. And then they made a choice none of our strategists had accounted for. They didn't retreat. They didn't fight for the world. They turned their remaining ships toward our fleet, unarmed cargo vessels among them, and simply refused to leave the system. They dared us to fire on ships full of nothing but their own people watching, recording, refusing to move. I felt something cold settle in my chest. You didn't fire. No commander in that fleet would give the order, Thesson said quietly. Not because they lacked strength, because none of them could predict what would happen next if they did. And an officer who cannot predict the outcome of an action will not take it, no matter how easy the action seems. That single moment cost us the mining rights, cost us 3 months of stalled operations, and cost the fleet commander his career. But it taught the council something far more important than any resource ever could. What was that? That humans do not calculate the way we calculate, he said. They do not weigh a decision only by what it costs them, or what it gains them. Sometimes they choose the option that serves no strategic purpose at all, and they choose it anyway, because it means something to them that our models cannot measure. That is why the report was buried. Not because it showed weakness, because it showed we could not predict them, and an enemy you cannot predict is worse than an enemy who is simply stronger. I looked back at the ship, hanging there in silence, and understood for the first time why the alarm that had woken me was different from every other alarm on the station. It was not a warning about power, it was a warning about the unknown. So what do we do now? Kalen asked. Thesson exhaled slowly. We talk to them, carefully, and we send someone who understands minds, not weapons. He turned to me. Ison, you're going aboard that ship. I had not expected that. My work had always been theoretical, models built from a distance, reports written in the safety of an office. I had never once stood face to face with the subject of my research, and certainly never one wrapped in 40 years of buried fear. Alone? I asked. A small delegation, he said. You'll lead it. Learn what you can. Do not provoke them. Do not threaten them. And Ison, do not assume you understand them, no matter what your models tell you. The last officer who assumed that lost more than his career. I spent the following hours preparing in a state somewhere between professional focus and quiet dread. I reviewed everything the council had on human history, which was far less than I expected for a species so feared. Fragments of their wars, fragments of their art, a species capable of extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary kindness within the same century, sometimes within the same decade, sometimes, it seemed, within the same person. There was no clean pattern to any of it. Every time I thought I had found a thread of logic to follow, I found a counterexample that unraveled it completely. What struck me most was a single passage in an old cultural summary, written by an analyst long since retired. It said that humans did not primarily act to survive, though they were fully capable of that. They acted, more often than any other species we had studied, according to what they valued, even when what they valued cost them everything. The analyst had written a note beside that observation, small and almost apologetic. This makes them very difficult to threaten. I read that line 3 times before boarding the shuttle. The trip across open space toward the human vessel felt longer than its actual duration. I sat beside 2 junior aides who said almost nothing, watching the silver hull grow larger against the black. Up close, the ship looked plain in a way I had not expected. No aggressive angles, no visible weapon arrays displayed for intimidation, nothing built to project power the way council vessels often were. It looked, if anything, functional, almost humble, and somehow that made it more unsettling, not less. A docking clamp extended from the human ship without being requested, locking onto our shuttle with practiced ease, as though they had done this exact thing 100 times before, though as far as our records showed, this was only their second true contact with the Council in living memory. When the airlock opened, I expected weapons. I expected guards. I expected the tension I had felt every single hour since the alarm first sounded. Instead, a single man stood waiting for us, hands loosely at his sides, wearing a simple gray uniform, with no visible rank markings beyond a small patch on his shoulder. He looked younger than I expected for a ship's commander, though something in his posture suggested he had earned whatever authority he carried the hard way. "You must be the delegation," he said, his voice calm, almost warm. "I'm Daniel Cole, captain of this ship. Come in, please. It's a long walk to the bridge, and I imagine you have a lot of questions." I stepped through the airlock, my aides close behind me, and felt the cold certainty settle over me that everything I had prepared for this meeting was about to be tested against something my models had never accounted for. "Thank you, Captain," I said carefully. "We have a great many questions." He smiled, but it was not the smile of a man hiding something. It was the smile of a man who had expected this exact sentence, word for word, and had already decided how he wanted to answer it. "I know," he said. "Let's start walking. I think you'll want to hear this sitting down." As we moved deeper into the ship, past quiet corridors and crew, who nodded politely but did not stare, I found myself doing something I had never done before, in 11 cycles of council service. I stopped trying to predict what would happen next, because for the first time, I genuinely did not know, and somewhere beneath the fear that thought should have produced, I felt something else entirely. A strange, quiet curiosity, the kind that had first drawn me into this work so many years ago, before I learned to be afraid of the answers I might find. The walk to the bridge took nearly 10 minutes, longer than the size of the ship seemed to justify, and I began to suspect the route had been chosen deliberately, giving me time to observe rather than simply arrive. Captain Cole pointed out nothing, explained nothing, and yet every corridor told me something. Small personal items sat beside workstations, photographs, handwritten notes, a child's drawing pinned above one console. These were not the sterile halls of a warship built purely for conflict. They were the halls of people who lived here, who had brought pieces of home into the void with them, who expected to still be themselves even this far from everything they knew. When we finally reached the bridge, it was smaller than I expected, built for efficiency rather than display. A woman rose from the command chair as we entered, tall, posed, her eyes moving across our delegation with the same unreadable calm the captain wore. "Grace Whitfield," she said. "First officer, Captain Cole tells me you have questions. So do we." I felt the aides beside me tense slightly, and I understood why. In every negotiation the council had ever conducted, questions were leverage, something to be given carefully, in exchange for something else. Here, it seemed, questions were simply offered, freely, as though information itself was not the weapon I had always assumed it to be. "We would be glad to answer what we can," I said, choosing my words with care. Captain Cole gestured toward a small seating area near the front viewport, away from the main consoles, and waited until we were all seated before he spoke again. Outside, the stars turned slowly, indifferent to everything unfolding inside the ship. "Before we go any further," he said, "I want to tell you something plainly, because I think plain honesty will save us both a lot of time. We know why you're afraid of us. We've read the reports your council tried to bury, the same way we've read every report anyone has ever tried to bury about us. And I understand the fear. I really do. But I want you to understand something too." He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady, without threat, without apology. "We didn't come here to prove we're dangerous. If we wanted to show you our strength, we wouldn't have sent one ship. We came because we wanted to talk to someone who might actually listen, instead of someone who only wants to calculate the safest way to make us disappear." I felt the weight of his words settle over the room, and for a long moment, none of us spoke. My aides glanced at me, waiting for direction I did not yet have. I thought of Thesson's warning, "Do not assume you understand them," and I thought of the old analyst's note, "This makes them very difficult to threaten," and slowly, carefully, I began to understand that the true danger the council feared had never been a weapon at all. It was sitting across from me, speaking with quiet patience, waiting to see what choice I would make next. I did not sleep that night, though the ship's cycle told me it was meant to be rest hours. My quarters aboard the human vessel were small but comfortable, and through the narrow viewport I could see Station Halvanar glowing faintly in the distance, a reminder that everything I had believed about power and prediction was being quietly dismantled one conversation at a time. I requested access to the ship's historical archive the following morning, expecting to be refused, or at least delayed while some officer decided what a council official should and should not see. Instead, Captain Cole simply authorized it himself. No hesitation, no negotiation, as though the idea of hiding their own history from a visitor had never occurred to him as something worth doing. "Read whatever you want," he told me over a shared meal in a small mess hall that smelled faintly of something warm and unfamiliar. "I'd rather you understood us wrong, because you didn't ask the right questions, than because we hid the answers from you." I began with the incident Thesson had described, the buried colony evacuation, and found the human record of it far more detailed than anything the council had kept. What struck me first was not the events themselves, which matched what I had already been told, but the tone of the record. There was no triumph in it, no celebration of having outmaneuvered a superior fleet. There was only a quiet, almost weary account of a decision made under pressure, written by people who clearly understood how easily it could have ended differently. I found a transcript of the colony administrator's final address to her people before the evacuation began. She had not promised victory. She had not promised safety. She had told them plainly that leaving the world might mean losing it forever, and that staying to fight might mean losing far more than the world. She had given them the choice, and the record showed that every single person aboard those evacuation ships had made it freely, knowing exactly what it might cost. I read further, deeper into human history, and the pattern the old analyst had noted began to reveal itself with uncomfortable clarity. Humans fought wars for resources and territory, the same as any other species, and yet scattered throughout their history were moments that made no strategic sense by any model I understood. People who gave up wealth for principles that gained them nothing. Nations that risked everything to help others, who could offer nothing in return. Individuals who chose difficult, costly paths simply because an easier path would have required becoming someone they did not want to be. It was not that humans lacked self-interest. I found plenty of evidence of greed, of fear, of cruelty, enough to fill volumes. But layered beneath all of it was something the Council's models had never accounted for, because the Council had never needed to account for it in any other species we had encountered. Humans were capable of choosing against their own survival instinct, not out of madness, but out of something closer to conviction. And a mind capable of that could never be fully predicted by threat alone, because threat only worked on minds that placed survival above everything else. I brought this observation to Captain Cole later that day, and he listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable until I finished. "You're not wrong," he said finally, "but I think you're only seeing half of it." "Then tell me the other half," I said. He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words the way a careful man chooses a path across uncertain ground. "It's not that we don't value survival. We do. Most of the choices you've been reading about weren't made carelessly. They were made because the people making them decided something else mattered more in that particular moment. That's the part your council's models miss, I think. It's not that we're unpredictable in general. It's that what we value can't always be measured the way resources or territory can be measured. You can build a model of what a person needs. It's much harder to build a model of what a person believes." I thought about that for a long time after our conversation ended. The Council had spent decades building increasingly precise models of need, of scarcity, of the mathematics of survival, and every one of those models had worked because every species we had encountered, ourselves included, ultimately obeyed the same underlying logic: survive first, prosper second. Everything else was negotiable when survival was truly at stake. Humans, it seemed, sometimes reversed that order entirely, and reversed it without warning, which meant any strategy built on assuming they would behave like every other species carried a hidden flaw that could not be corrected, only avoided. That evening, I requested a private conversation with Grace Whitfield, curious whether her perspective would differ from her captain's. She agreed without hesitation, meeting me in a small observation lounge near the ship's stern, where the stars stretched endlessly beyond thick reinforced glass. "You've been reading our history," she said. Not quite a question. I have. It's given me more questions than answers. She smiled faintly. That tends to happen. Most people expect a single explanation for why humans do what we do. There isn't one. We're not a single mind. We're 8 billion different ones, all pulling in different directions, and somehow, most of the time, enough of us pull together to get something done. But the Council fears a very specific thing, I said. Not your numbers, not your weapons. A choice. One choice, made once, by one commander or one people, that cannot be predicted or countered, because it does not follow the logic your enemy expects. Her expression shifted slightly, something more serious settling behind her eyes. That's part of it, but I think the deeper fear, the one your council hasn't fully named yet, isn't about a single choice at all. It's about the fact that we could make any number of different choices in the exact same situation, depending on what we decide matters most that day. Your council builds strategy assuming an enemy will act the same way twice under the same conditions. We don't always. And that means every plan built to counter us has an expiration date your council can't calculate in advance. I sat with that thought long after she left the lounge, watching the slow turn of unfamiliar stars, and understood for the first time the true shape of the fear that had gripped Station Halvanar the moment that alarm sounded. It was not fear of a weapon, however powerful. Weapons could be measured, countered, deterred. It was fear of a mind that refused to be reduced to a formula, a mind capable of surprising even itself. The following days passed in a strange rhythm of formal negotiation sessions and quiet personal conversations, and I began to notice something troubling beneath the surface of our official talks. Administrator Kalen, communicating remotely from the station, grew increasingly impatient with the pace of discussions. She wanted concrete terms, clear boundaries, a resolution that could be filed and closed and forgotten. The humans, by contrast, seemed content to let the conversation unfold at whatever speed genuine understanding required, unbothered by the growing frustration on our side. During one particularly tense session, Kalen transmitted a message directly to me, marked private, bypassing the official channel entirely. Her tone, even through text, carried the sharp edge of someone whose patience had worn dangerously thin. This delegation has been aboard that ship for 4 days, with nothing to show for it, the message read. The Council does not have the luxury of waiting for humans to decide how they feel about talking to us. I need results, Ison. Concrete terms, or grounds, to justify a firmer approach. I read the message twice, feeling something cold settle in my chest. A firmer approach, in Council language, was never a phrase used lightly, and I understood exactly what it implied, especially given what Thesson had told me about the last time a fleet commander's patience had run out around a human vessel. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I found Captain Cole in the ship's small command room, reviewing reports with Whitfield at his side, and I told him plainly what Kalen had said, because I had decided somewhere in the last 4 days that honesty, however uncomfortable, was the only currency that seemed to hold real value aboard this ship. He did not look surprised. If anything, he looked almost resigned, as though he had been waiting for exactly this message to arrive. "How much time do you think we have?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted. But Administrator Kalen is not someone who waits patiently once she believes a situation has stalled, and there is a faction within the Council, I'm told, that would prefer decisive action over prolonged uncertainty. Whitfield exchanged a glance with her captain, something passing between them that I could not fully read. "Then it's time to show them what we actually came here to offer," she said, "before someone decides to take it from us instead of asking for it." I did not yet understand what she meant, but something in the careful weight of her words told me that everything I thought I understood about this negotiation was about to change, and that the true test of everything I had learned aboard this ship was still ahead of me, waiting just beyond the next conversation. Captain Cole called for a full session the next morning, requesting that Administrator Kalen join remotely alongside High Marshal Thesson, and I felt the tension in the room shift the moment the connection opened. Kalen's projected image appeared sharp and impatient, her arms folded, her expression already braced for disappointment. Thesson stood beside her, saying nothing, watching with the quiet attention of a man who had learned long ago that the most important information in any negotiation often arrived in the pauses between words. "Captain Cole," Kalen said, without preamble, My delegation has spent 4 days aboard your ship. I would like to know what, precisely, we have gained from that time. Cole did not flinch at her tone. He simply nodded, as though the question was fair and expected. You've gained an understanding of what we're actually offering, Administrator. I think it's time I stopped letting you guess at it. He gestured, and a display activated at the center of the room, showing a star chart I did not recognize at first. It took me a moment to realize it depicted the contested border region itself, the same space where our sensor arrays and battle stations sat, the same space that had triggered every alarm on Station Halvanar 11 days earlier. We didn't come here for territory, Cole said. We didn't come here for resources, and we didn't come here to threaten anyone. We came because our long-range surveys detected something in this sector that concerns us both. A drift pattern in the outer debris field, consistent with an old, unstable weapons cache, left behind by a species that no longer exists. If it destabilizes, and our models suggest it will within the next several years, the resulting cascade would damage every settlement within 6 systems, yours included. Kaylin's expression flickered, surprise breaking briefly through her composure before she caught herself. Our own surveys found no such anomaly. Your surveys weren't built to find it, Whitfield said, stepping forward beside her captain. It's not something Council sensor technology is designed to detect. We only found it because one of our long-range science vessels happened to be mapping this region 8 months ago, using methods your ships don't currently carry. I watched Kaylin's face carefully, the way I had been trained to watch every face in every negotiation, and saw something complicated pass behind her eyes. Suspicion, certainly, but beneath it, something closer to disbelief, as though the idea that a single human ship had traveled this far simply to warn us of a danger we could not yet see was too foreign a concept to accept easily. Why would you do this? She asked finally. You could have sent this information through a formal channel. A data packet, a diplomatic transmission. Why send a warship? Why send your own people into space you knew we would consider hostile? Cole was quiet for a moment before answering, and when he did, his voice carried none of the calculation I might have expected from a council official in the same position. Because a data packet gets filed and forgotten. Because a transmission from an unknown source gets treated as a possible trick, exactly the way your administrator is treating this conversation right now. We needed someone to see this information delivered by people willing to sit across from you and answer every question you had, face to face, until you believed it. That required a ship, and it required someone willing to risk being fired upon to deliver it. Thesson finally spoke, his voice low, careful. You risked your entire crew, on the chance we might listen instead of striking first. Yes, Cole said simply. We did. The room fell silent, and I found myself thinking back to the incident Thesson had described on the first day, the buried colony evacuation, the choice that had made no strategic sense to any council commander who studied it afterward. I understood now, watching this conversation unfold, that the two events were built from the same underlying pattern. Humans were willing to accept enormous personal risk, not because they miscalculated the danger, but because they had decided something else mattered more than the danger itself. Kaylin studied the star chart for a long moment, her sharp composure slowly giving way to something more thoughtful. Assuming this information is genuine, she said, why should the Council trust a warning delivered under these circumstances? You understand how this appears. A single ship arrives unannounced, claims urgent knowledge of a hidden threat, and asks us to reposition our defenses based on your word alone. I understand exactly how it appears, Cole said, which is why we're not asking you to take our word alone. We're offering full access to our survey data, our detection methods, and a joint verification mission, using both our instruments and yours, so your own scientists can confirm what we found independently. We're not asking for trust yet, Administrator. We're asking for the chance to earn it. I saw Thesson's expression shift slightly, something that might have been respect, carefully guarded beneath decades of military discipline. Kaylin, for her part, remained silent for a long moment, weighing something I could not fully read. And if the verification mission finds nothing, she asked, then you'll have lost a few days and gained a working relationship with a species you were prepared to fear blindly, Cole said. We think that's a fair trade either way. It was in that moment, watching the careful, deliberate honesty of his answer, that I understood something the old analyst's report had only hinted at. The council had spent decades assuming that an unpredictable species must therefore be a dangerous one, because unpredictability had always, in every prior encounter, been a precursor to conflict. But I was beginning to see that humans could be unpredictable in service of something other than aggression. Their choices did not follow a fixed formula, but that did not mean their choices were reckless. It meant they were guided by something the council had never learned to measure, something closer to conviction than calculation. The meeting continued for another hour, details exchanged, verification protocols proposed and revised, and by its end, Kaylin had agreed, cautiously, to authorize a joint mission, though I could tell from her tone that her trust remained thin, stretched carefully over a foundation of lingering suspicion. Thesson said little more, but before the connection closed, he addressed Cole directly, his voice carrying a weight I had not heard from him before. 40 years ago, he said, a fleet under my command hesitated in front of a choice we didn't understand, and it cost us dearly in ways beyond the mining rights we lost. I've spent every year since trying to understand what happened that day. I think, Captain Cole, I am finally beginning to... Cole inclined his head slightly, something quiet and respectful in the gesture. I hope this time, Marshal, we can understand each other, before it costs either of us anything at all. The connection closed, and the room exhaled collectively, the tension of the last hour bleeding slowly out of every posture around me. I remained seated for a long moment, turning the conversation over in my mind, when Whitfield approached and sat beside me, her expression thoughtful. You look troubled, she said. I am, I admitted. Not because I doubt what you've told us, because I'm beginning to understand how badly my own counsel has misjudged you, and I don't yet know what that means for either of us going forward. She was quiet for a moment, watching the star chart still glowing faintly at the center of the room. It means the hardest part is still ahead, she said finally. Trust doesn't come from one good meeting, Ison. It comes from what happens the next time someone is tempted to break it. And I don't think everyone on your council is going to be as patient as your marshal. I did not know, in that moment, how quickly her words would prove true, or how soon the fragile trust we had built would be tested by exactly the kind of impatience she had warned me about. But I felt it settling over the ship like a shadow crossing the sun, a quiet certainty that the true danger of this encounter had not yet arrived, and that when it did, it would not come from the humans at all. The joint verification mission was scheduled to launch within 2 days, and for the first time since the alarm on Station Halvanar had torn me from my quarters, I allowed myself to believe that this encounter might end without conflict. I should have known better than to trust that feeling. In 11 cycles of council service, I had learned that fear, once it takes root in an institution, rarely disappears simply because the evidence no longer supports it. It only waits for a new reason to justify itself. That reason arrived in the form of Director Voss Kalith, a name I recognized immediately from closed session records I had reviewed years earlier. Kalith represented the Sentinel Compact, a hardline faction within the Council that had argued for decades that any species capable of matching Council technology should be neutralized before it could grow strong enough to threaten Council dominance. He had opposed the joint mission from the moment word of it reached the wider Council chambers, and he had not stayed quiet about his objections. I learned of his involvement through an encrypted transmission that reached me privately aboard the human ship, sent by an old colleague who still worked within Council command. The message was brief, but its meaning was unmistakable. Kalith had convinced a narrow majority of the Sentinel Compact that the human warning about the debris field was either fabricated or irrelevant, a distraction meant to delay a Council response while human reinforcements moved into position elsewhere. He had requested authorization for a preemptive strike against the human vessel, framed not as an act of aggression, but as a necessary precaution against a threat the Council could not fully understand. I brought the message to Captain Cole immediately, my hands unsteady as I handed him the translated transcript. He read it in silence, his expression unreadable, while Whitfield read over his shoulder, her jaw tightening with each line. How much authorization does he have? Cole asked finally. I don't know, I admitted. The Sentinel Compact doesn't hold full command authority, but if he's convinced even a narrow majority, he may have enough support to order a strike from the nearest battle station without needing full Council approval. Administrator Kalin and Marshal Thesson may not even know this is happening yet. Cole set the transcript down carefully, and I watched something settle behind his eyes, calm and grim at once. the expression of a man who had prepared for exactly this possibility long before it became real. How long do we have? I checked the timestamp against the station's operational logs I still had partial access to. If he moves quickly, hours, perhaps less. To my surprise, Cole did not order the ship to retreat. He did not raise shields, did not move toward weapon stations, did not do any of the things I would have expected from a commander facing imminent attack. Instead, he turned to Whitfield and asked her a single question, his voice quiet but certain. "Is the contingency ready?" "It has been since the moment we crossed the border," she said. I looked between them, confusion and rising alarm competing for space in my chest. What contingency? If Calith orders a strike, you have minutes to act, not hours. I don't understand what you're planning. Cole turned to me, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something entirely unguarded in his expression, an honesty stripped of diplomatic caution. "We knew, coming here, that someone on your council might try exactly this. Every species we've encountered has had a Calith. Someone convinced that the only safe response to the unknown is to remove it before it can become a threat. We didn't come here without a plan for that possibility." "Then what is the plan?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Retreat? Return fire? A show of force to make him reconsider?" "None of those," he said. I stared at him, waiting for the rest of the answer, but he simply gestured for me to follow him toward the bridge, where the full crew had already gathered, moving with a calm efficiency that told me they had rehearsed whatever was coming next more than once. Whitfield activated a display, showing our position relative to the nearest council battle station, close enough that a strike, if launched, would reach us within minutes of being fired. "Lower the shields," Cole ordered. I felt my breath catch. "Captain, if Director Calith authorizes that strike, and your shields are down, your ship will be destroyed before you can raise them again." "I know," he said, without hesitation. "Then why?" "Because a ship with its shields raised looks like a threat preparing to defend itself," Whitfield said, her voice calm despite the gravity of what she was describing. "And a threat preparing to defend itself gives men like your director exactly the justification they're looking for. A ship with its shields down, broadcasting an open channel, asking to be heard instead of feared, gives him nothing to point to except his own decision to fire on people who never raised a weapon against him." I understood then, with a clarity that struck me like cold water, exactly what they intended. It was the colony evacuation again, 40 years distant but identical in its bones. A choice that offered no strategic advantage, that in fact increased their immediate danger, made deliberately because the value it protected mattered more to them than the risk it created. "This could get you killed," I said, my voice barely steady. "All of you. For a chance that one man might hesitate." "It's not really about him hesitating," Cole said quietly, watching the display where the battle station's position blinked steadily in the dark. "It's about what happens after, whether he fires or not. If we raise shields and prepare to fight, and this ends in conflict, every report written about today will say the humans reacted with force the moment they were threatened. Exactly the story your director once told. If we lower our shields and open a channel instead, and he still fires, then every report written about today will show exactly what kind of choice he made, with nothing to hide behind. And if he doesn't fire, then we've shown your entire council something no threat report ever could." "What is that?" I asked. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw not the calm diplomat who had spoken so carefully during our negotiations, but the man underneath, the one who had made this decision long before he ever crossed into contested space, that we'd rather risk everything on the chance that reason might win than protect ourselves by giving fear one more reason to be right. The channel opened moments later, broadcast wide enough to reach every council vessel and station within the sector, including, I would later learn, Director Calith's own command post. Cole's voice, steady and unhurried, carried across every frequency, an open invitation rather than a demand, offering nothing but the plain truth of their intentions, and the simple fact that their shields, visible on every sensor array watching, remained lowered. I stood on that bridge, watching the seconds stretch into what felt like hours, and understood that I was witnessing something the Council had feared for 40 years without ever fully naming it. Not a weapon, not a fleet, a choice, made freely, by people willing to risk everything on the belief that it was the right one to make, regardless of what it cost them if they were wrong. Somewhere across the dark distance between our positions and that battle station, Director Voss Kalith was making a choice of his own, and none of us, not the Council's finest strategists, not my own carefully built models, not even the humans who had studied this exact kind of moment for generations, could say with any certainty what that choice would be. The silence on that bridge stretched long enough that I began counting my own heartbeats simply to have something steady to hold on to. Every screen showing the battle station's status remained unchanged, weapons systems dormant, no launch sequence detected, and yet none of us dared to call that safety. A weapon could be readied in seconds. A decision, once made, could be executed faster than any of us could react. I watched Captain Cole throughout those minutes, searching his face for some sign of doubt, some flicker of regret, at the risk he had chosen to take with the lives of everyone aboard his ship. I found none. He stood at the center of the bridge, hands folded calmly behind his back, watching the same screens the rest of us watched, and whatever fear he carried it in a way that did not show. It was Whitfield who finally broke the silence, her voice low, channel still open, no response yet. "Keep it open," Cole said, "as long as it takes." I thought of Director Kalith, somewhere aboard that battle station, weighing a decision that would define far more than this single encounter. I had read enough of his closed-session arguments to understand his reasoning, and troubling as I found it, I could not dismiss it entirely as irrational. He believed, sincerely, that any delay in confronting a potentially superior threat was a delay that could cost the Council everything, later, when the advantage had shifted too far to recover. It was not cruelty that drove men like Kalith. It was fear, dressed carefully in the language of caution, until it became indistinguishable from wisdom. The response, when it finally came, did not arrive as weapons fire. It arrived as a second transmission, cutting into the open channel, and I recognized the voice immediately. Administrator Kalin, her tone sharp with an urgency I had not heard from her before, addressing not the human ship, but the battle station directly, her words carrying the unmistakable authority of formal Council command. "Director Kalith, this is Administrator Kalin, transmitting under full Council authorization. Stand down immediately. Any strike against that vessel without my explicit approval will be treated as an unauthorized act, and you will answer for it personally before the full Council chamber." A long pause followed, tense enough that I found myself holding my breath without meaning to. Then, finally, the battle station's weapons systems, which had remained in a state of readiness throughout the entire exchange, powered down, the threat receding as quietly as it had arrived. I felt the relief hit me almost physically, my knees weak enough that I gripped the edge of a console to steady myself. Around me, the human crew exhaled as one, though their composure never fully broke, as though this outcome, while deeply desired, had never been assumed as guaranteed. Cole was the first to speak, his voice quiet, directed at Whitfield rather than the wider room. "Close the channel. Let's give the administrator room to handle her own people." As the immediate danger passed, I found myself turning to Whitfield with a question that had been building in me since the moment the shields came down. "How did you know Administrator Kalin would intervene?" "You couldn't have been certain she even knew what Kalith was planning." "We didn't know," she said simply. "That was never the plan. Lowering our shields wasn't a bet that someone would save us. It was a decision about who we wanted to be if no one did." I did not fully understand her words until later that evening, sitting alone in my quarters, replaying the entire encounter in my mind. The human choice had never been calculated to produce a specific rescue. It had been made regardless of whether rescue arrived at all, because the value it expressed mattered to them, independent of the outcome. That single distinction, I realized, was the very thing my models had always failed to capture. I had spent my career building predictions based on what a species needed to survive and prosper. I had never learned to model what a species chose to become, even in the moment its survival hung in the balance. Word of the incident spread quickly through Council channels over the following day, and the reaction split sharply along lines I had begun to expect. Those already inclined toward caution and diplomacy pointed to the humans' restraint as proof that peaceful engagement remained possible, perhaps even preferable, to the alternative. Those aligned with Kalith's faction argued the opposite, insisting that the humans' willingness to risk annihilation rather than defend themselves was itself proof of a dangerous unpredictability, a mindset too foreign to ever be safely trusted. I found myself caught uncomfortably between both arguments, unable to fully embrace either. I understood, now, why the humans acted as they did, but understanding a choice did not automatically make its implications less unsettling. A species capable of accepting destruction rather than compromising its principles was, in its own way, exactly as difficult to predict as a species capable of striking without warning. The difference lay only in which direction the unpredictability pointed. Director Calith did not disappear after his failed strike attempt. He requested, through formal channels, an audience with the full council chamber, insisting that the incident proved rather than disproved his concerns. I was summoned to testify before that chamber myself, my findings from 11 days aboard the human vessel required as evidence in a debate that would shape council policy toward humanity for years to come. I spent the night before that testimony reviewing every note I had taken, every conversation I had recorded, searching for some way to present the truth of what I had witnessed, without oversimplifying it into a conclusion that either faction could weaponize for their own purposes. The humans were not saints, incapable of aggression or self-interest. Their own history proved that clearly enough, but neither were they the singular existential threat Calith insisted they represented, a species whose unpredictability made peaceful coexistence impossible. The truth, as I understood it, sitting alone with my notes in the quiet hours before dawn, was something far more difficult for the council to accept than either simple conclusion. Humans could not be reliably predicted, not because they were irrational, but because their choices were guided by values that shifted priority depending on circumstance, sometimes placing survival first, and sometimes placing something else above it entirely. There was no formula that could account for that variability with certainty, which meant the Council's entire framework for managing relationships between species, built as it was on predictable deterrence, would never fully apply to humanity. I did not know, that night, whether the council chamber would be willing to hear that truth, or whether fear of the unknown would prove, once again, more persuasive than the careful nuance the situation actually demanded. But I knew that whatever I chose to say before that chamber the following day would shape more than a single policy decision. It would shape whether the council chose to meet humanity's difficult, unpredictable choices with understanding, or with the same fear that had nearly cost lives only hours earlier. For the first time in 11 cycles of careful, measured council service, I understood that I too was facing a choice that could not be fully calculated in advance, one where the value of honesty might cost me more than a comfortable silence ever would. The council chamber on the central sphere was larger than any room I had ever stood in, a vast circular hall ringed with tiered seating for representatives of every member species, their voices and colors and postures a living record of everything the council had built over centuries of careful, cautious expansion. I had testified before smaller committees many times in my career, but never before the full chamber, and never on a matter so heavily contested before I even opened my mouth. Director Calith spoke first, as was his right, having formally requested the session. He was a compact, sharp-featured man, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had spent decades convincing rooms exactly like this one to see the galaxy through his particular lens of caution. He laid out his argument methodically, citing the buried colony incident from 40 years earlier, citing the humans' willingness to lower their shields in the face of a potential strike, framing both not as evidence of restraint, but as evidence of a species so confident in its own eventual dominance that it no longer feared conventional deterrence at all. A predictable enemy can be managed, he said, his voice carrying easily to every tier of the chamber. A predictable ally can be trusted. What we have encountered is neither. A species that treats its own survival as negotiable is a species that has already decided the rules the rest of us live by simply do not apply to them. I do not say this to condemn them. I say this because a threat that cannot be modeled is, by definition, a threat we cannot prepare for, and a council unprepared for the threats it faces is a council that has already failed the species it was built to protect. Murmurs rippled through the tiers as he finished, and I felt the weight of the room's uncertainty pressing down on me, even before Administrator Kalen called my name to give testimony of my own. I rose slowly, aware of every eye turning toward me, aware that whatever I said in the next few minutes would be recorded, debated, and referenced for years in whatever policy emerged from this session. I began, as I had planned the night before, with the plain facts of what I had witnessed. The colony evacuation, the debris field warning, the lowered shields. I laid them out without embellishment, resisting the urge to shape them into a conclusion before the chamber had heard the full account. When I finished the recitation, I paused, gathering the words I had struggled to find in the quiet hours before dawn. Director Calith is not wrong that humans cannot be reliably modeled the way every other species we have encountered can be modeled, I said. I spent 11 days aboard their vessel, searching for the pattern beneath their choices, and I did not find a fixed formula. But I did not find chaos either. What I found was something the Council has never had to account for, because every species we have encountered until now has placed survival above all other values, consistently, predictably, in every circumstance where survival was truly threatened. Humans do not. Sometimes they do exactly what our models expect. Sometimes they choose something else entirely, guided by principles that shift priority depending on what they believe is at stake in that particular moment. I felt the chamber's attention sharpen, and I pressed forward before my nerve could fail me. Director Calith calls this a threat we cannot prepare for. I would suggest instead that it is a threat we have never needed the tools to understand, because we built our entire framework of diplomacy on the assumption that fear alone would always be sufficient to predict an enemy's next move. Humans have shown us, twice now, that fear is not always the deciding factor in their choices. That does not make them safe, but it also does not make them the existential danger Director Calith describes. It makes them something the Council has simply never had to negotiate with before. A mind that chooses, rather than a mind that merely calculates. Calith rose again, his voice sharper this time. And how does the Council negotiate with a mind that cannot be predicted, Analyst Korath? What framework do you propose we build, when the very foundation of every treaty we have ever signed depends on both parties understanding what the other stands to lose? I had expected this question, and I answered it as honestly as I could, knowing my answer would satisfy neither his caution nor the comfortable certainty the rest of the chamber wanted from me. I don't have a complete framework, Director. I don't think anyone in this chamber does. Not yet. What I can tell you is that the humans offered us something during this encounter that no threat display ever could. They offered us the truth, freely, before we asked for it, at real cost to themselves, because they believed trust had to be built honestly, or not built at all. I think the Council's task now is not to find a new formula to predict them. I think it is to decide whether we are willing to build a relationship with a species that cannot be fully predicted, based on something other than fear. Because I do not believe humans respond well to fear, Director. I believe, based on everything I witnessed, that they respond to honesty, and to being met as equals, rather than as a threat to be contained. The chamber fell into a long, uncertain silence, and I could see, even from where I stood, that my testimony had not resolved the debate so cleanly as either faction had hoped. Some representatives nodded slowly, weighing the nuance I had offered. Others exchanged uneasy glances, unsatisfied by an answer that offered no simple certainty to cling to. Administrator Kalin finally spoke, her voice measured, carrying the weight of someone who had watched this entire situation unfold from its very first moment. The chamber will take Analyst Korath's testimony under advisement, alongside Director Calith's concerns. A formal policy recommendation will require further study before any binding decision is made regarding humanity's status within contested space. It was not the resolution either side had wanted, but it was, I understood, the only honest outcome available. The Council was not built to make quick decisions about the truly unknown, and humanity, for all my testimony had tried to explain them, remained genuinely unknown in ways that could not be resolved by a single hearing, however carefully argued. As the chamber began to empty, Marshal Thesson approached me quietly, his expression thoughtful. "You told them the truth, even knowing it would satisfy no one," he said. "That took more courage than I expected from an analyst who has spent his career building careful, comfortable models." "I learned something aboard that ship," I said. "Sometimes the honest answer is the only one worth giving, even when it costs you the certainty everyone else wants from you." He studied me for a long moment, something like recognition passing behind his weathered eyes. "That sounds like something a human might say." I found myself almost smiling at that, despite the weight of everything the day had carried. "Perhaps it is. I said. Perhaps that is exactly the point. I left the chamber that evening uncertain what policy the council would eventually adopt, uncertain whether Calith's faction would find new grounds to press their case, uncertain, even, whether the fragile trust built aboard Captain Cole's ship would survive the slow grinding process of council politics that now stood between this single encounter and any lasting peace. But I understood, walking alone through the quiet halls of the central sphere, that I had made my own choice that day, freely, at real cost to the comfortable certainty I had built my entire career upon, and that understanding, however small, felt like the beginning of something the council had never truly possessed before now. 3 months passed before the council reached any formal conclusion regarding humanity's status within contested space, and I spent every one of those months returning, again and again, to the notes I had taken aboard Captain Cole's ship, searching for language precise enough to bridge the gap between what I had witnessed and what the council was prepared to accept. The joint verification mission had gone forward as promised, and the debris field warning had proven accurate, a discovery that shifted the tone of the debate more than any testimony I had given, because it offered the one thing every faction within the chamber still valued above all else: proof. The Sentinel Compact did not disappear, and Director Calith did not abandon his position, though the failed strike attempt had cost him a portion of the authority he once carried so easily through the chamber. He continued to argue, in every session that followed, that humanity's unpredictability remained a danger the council could not safely ignore, and in the narrow, technical sense of his argument, I could not honestly disagree with him. Humans could not be modeled the way every other species we had encountered could be modeled. That much had proven true beyond any reasonable doubt. What changed, slowly, over those 3 months, was not the accuracy of Calith's observation, but the meaning the wider council chose to draw from it. I found myself invited to smaller sessions, private consultations with representatives from species who had grown weary of council policy, built entirely around deterrence and threat calculation, who found something quietly hopeful in the idea that not every powerful species in the galaxy operated purely on the logic of self-interest. I did not convince all of them. I did not expect to, but I convinced enough. The final policy, when it emerged, was not the sweeping alliance some optimists had hoped for, nor the strict containment protocol Calith's faction had pushed for since the beginning. It was something more careful, more provisional, an agreement to establish formal diplomatic channels with humanity, built not on the assumption of predictable behavior, but on the explicit acknowledgement that predictability could not be guaranteed, and that trust, where it existed at all, would need to be built and rebuilt continuously, through honest engagement, rather than static treaty language. I returned to Captain Cole's ship one final time before it departed contested space, carrying the formal terms of the new arrangement, though I suspected, watching his expression as he reviewed the document, that he had already guessed most of its contents long before I arrived. "It's not everything," I told him, standing once more in that small observation lounge where I had first begun to understand what I was truly dealing with. There are still factions within the council who believe this arrangement is a mistake, and Director Calith will not stop pressing his case simply because he lost this particular vote. "That's fine," Cole said, setting the document down with the same calm I remembered from our very first meeting. "We didn't come here expecting unanimous trust, Ison. We came here hoping for a chance." This is a chance. I thought of Whitfield's words from the observation lounge, all those months ago, that trust did not come from one good meeting, but from what happened the next time someone was tempted to break it. I understood now, more fully than I had then, that the Council's true test had never been the 11 days I spent aboard this ship, or the tense hour when a battle station's weapons had powered toward readiness before standing down. The true test was still ahead, spread across every future encounter, every future choice either side would make, when the easier, safer path might have offered more comfortable certainty. "Can I ask you something?" I said, before he could turn away. "Of course. That day, when you lowered your shields, if Administrator Kalen hadn't intervened, if Director Calith had given that order anyway, would it have been worth it, knowing what it might have cost you?" He considered the question for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the viewport, toward the same slow turn of stars that had accompanied nearly every conversation we had shared aboard this ship. "I think about that more than I probably should," he admitted finally. "But yes, I think it would have been worth it, even then." Not because we wanted to die, Ison. We didn't. We wanted to live, badly, the same as anyone does. But we wanted to live as the people we chose to be, not as people who had let fear decide who we became. If we'd raised our shields that day, prepared to fight, and Caliph had struck anyway, at least we would have died having tried to be reasonable first. That mattered to us. It still does. I did not have a response worthy of that answer, and for a long moment, we simply stood together, watching the stars, two minds built from entirely different worlds, slowly learning to understand something the other had always carried, without needing to explain it. When his ship finally departed contested space, weeks later, I stood once more on the deck of Station Halvanar, watching its silver hull shrink slowly into the dark, and I found myself thinking not of the danger it had once represented, but of everything I had learned standing in its quiet corridors. The Council had spent 40 years afraid of a single, unpredictable choice, a moment when a human commander might act outside every model built to contain them. I understood now that the fear had never truly been about a single choice at all. It was about the deeper truth that choice represented, the terrifying, undeniable fact that humanity could not be reduced to a formula, because they refused to let survival alone define who they were willing to become. I still build models today, still study patterns, still search for the underlying logic that governs how a species behaves under pressure. But I no longer believe every mind can be fully predicted, and I have come to understand that this uncertainty is not always a danger to be feared. Sometimes it is simply the shape of a mind capable of choosing something greater than its own survival, and a galaxy that learns to recognize that difference, rather than fearing it blindly, might finally understand why humanity had never needed a fleet to change the course of everything the Council once believed unshakable. They had only ever needed the chance to choose.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.